Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop role-playing game that's been around since the 1970s, in fact 1974 is when it first came out, is an iconic franchise in the gaming sphere and to the realms of nerd and geekdom everywhere. However, the thing about Dungeons & Dragons is that it has had not that many outings into the realms of entertainment beyond the gaming space. Yes, there are plenty of actual video games and tabletop games, of course, of Dungeons & Dragons, but in terms of movies, TV, aren't that many. There was a TV show, cartoon in fact, back in the 80s and 90s, that is quite good, I will say, especially going back on it, but the movie-wise has not been that good. So I took it upon myself to watch all of the Dungeons & Dragons movies, or I should say almost all of the Dungeons & Dragons movies that have been released, to try and see what happened with them. Now, to start off though, if you don't know what Dungeons & Dragons is though, let me explain. So it was developed as a tabletop RPG by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and was published by the studio Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, in 1974. Players take on the roles of heroic characters as they tell a story together and venture through a fantastic world developed by the Dungeon Master, or going off of a book written by Wizards of the Coast, TSR, whoever wrote the book. A set of dice are also used to calculate certain rolls to add to the storytelling and to the gameplay aspect of it. And also the rights of the game were purchased by Wizards of the Coast in 1997 as well, and they are now a subsidiary of Hasbro. They'll come back up later. But either way, in terms of media though, in terms of films, there have been, technically speaking, 4 Dungeons & Dragons officially licensed movies. There is technically an animated movie about the Dragonlance franchise, but we're not going to talk about that because that movie is not that good and doesn't really count here. But overall, there have been 4 actual licensed Dungeons & Dragons movies. The first one released in 2000, and then there were 2 others released basically on home video. And then there's the latest one that just recently came out, Honor Among Thieves, that came out in theaters, produced by Hasbro itself. So how are these movies? Do they feel like the games? Are they good? Are they bad? And what is the point of all of this as well? Can Dungeons & Dragons, a fantasy role-playing game where you tell stories with your friends, actually translate to film? Let's find out. Let their blood rain from the sky! The first Dungeons & Dragons movie was released in the year 2000 and it was directed by Courtney Solomon and written by a bunch of people, including also supposedly Gary Gygax, who was in a cameo that was in a cutscene. However, fun fact about this movie, Courtney Solomon actually bought the rights to make a D&D movie in the year 1990, but it took him 10 years to raise the funds for this movie. However, after watching the movie, I don't know where those funds went. Is this movie any good? Does it feel like Dungeons & Dragons? And why was it made? Well, to answer all those questions, simply no. Just simply no is the answer here. This movie is not good. If you've seen anything from it or seen any of the memes or jokes from it, this movie's not good. It doesn't feel like anything, to be honest, and it was honestly kind of painful to watch, and not even in the sense of it feeling dated like a 2000s movie, it just wasn't good. But in terms of a Dungeons & Dragons movie, there were hardly any references to the actual source material at all. None of the characters represented any of the classes of the game at that time. There were really no actual references to character races or to creatures from Dungeons & Dragons. Yes, there was a dwarf and an elf, but they didn't necessarily feel like dwarves or elves. They just were people with some prosthetics or a large beard to showcase. There's also a couple of other background characters that are supposed to be fantasy creatures that look nothing like anything from Dungeons & Dragons at all. However, there is, technically speaking, one instance in the movie of an actual creature from D&D, and it's a very, very poorly CG animated beholder for some reason. It's just kind of there. No real reason why. However, the thing about this movie that doesn't feel like Dungeons & Dragons either, beyond it not referencing anything from the game, is the fact that the characters don't feel like they belong in the world that they're presented in, nor in a D&D game. The other issue is the fact that the story revolves around a singular hero as opposed to a party of heroes. This whole plot is very generic. in a way, which is something you can't say about Dungeons and Dragons. None of the stories of D&D from any table you can go to and talk to is simple, or by the numbers, or generic. I mean, yeah, you can use some tropes for sure, but nothing's ever generic like this. The other issue with the movie itself is that the tone is all over the place, and it has no idea what it is. However, one good part about the movie, and also a part that feels kind of Dungeons & Dragons-y, it's just Jeremy Irons. Jeremy Irons is overacting so much in this movie, and it honestly does feel kind of like one of those comical, plotty villains that a DM would make at like 3 in the morning because they forgot to actually write anything for their main villain of their campaign. Also, Jeremy Irons is Jeremy Irons. He's pretty great.
Let their blood rain from the sky!
Overall, none of this movie feels like a Dungeons & Dragons movie. None of it feels hardly like a fantasy movie of any sort, and it's even worse the fact that The Lord of the Rings came out a year later. Yes, Fellowship of the Ring came out in 2001, a whole year after this movie. The main point is that this first Dungeons & Dragons movie is not good, and nor is it a true D&D movie.
How can we be sure that she too won't go berserk and put us all at risk?
After the commercial and critical flop that was the first D&D movie, for some reason they decided to make a second one. However, this one had less than half of the budget of the first movie and was made directly for TV, which, that's fine. Honestly, in this situation, kind of worked out for the better. But in 2005, they made Wrath of the Dragon God, directed by Gary Lively. Now, compared to the first movie, this movie's actually pretty solid. Now, yes, it does in fact have its issues, and it is in fact a made-for-TV movie, so there's only a certain bar you have to understand when going into it to even view it, but it's not bad. It's really not bad if you're looking for an actual D&D movie. Now, the funny thing is that for this original trilogy, yes, they made 3 of them, of D&D films, they all take place in the same world, which was a original creation for these movies. It doesn't actually take place in any of the established D&D canon, but that's fine. But this movie actually felt like a D&D movie. They actually used artwork from the 3rd edition books in the opening. They actually have fantasy races and creatures from the game, which is very cool. The main characters are actually a legitimate party of adventurers representing the classes that they would represent, and representing them pretty well, I will say. And while there is still a singular hero in the end, the rest of the party actually does feel like they belong, unlike in the first film, where they were just all complete side characters and had nothing to do if the main character wasn't doing anything. This one, they actually did stuff, like the rogue actually was very important in a dungeon crawl situation to get rid of traps. The barbarian was great at fighting off a horde of enemies so they could get into the dungeon. The wizard was amazing at holding off things and fighting a dragon. There was actually a dragon, actually 2 of them, and they actually had an orc. Now, I'll be honest, it looked like a goblin, but there was an orc. The main bad guy had an orc as a partner. That's pretty cool. But this movie suffered a lot from the fact that it had basically no budget at all, and still had some tropey elements from 2005. And also, for some reason, there were no people of color in the cast, which was very odd, but I'm not going to talk much about that. But either way, in terms of a D&D movie, it's not bad. Even better was on the special features of the DVD release of the movie. Behind the scenes, the writer of the film was actually an avid D&D player and loved 3rd edition, which was the main edition out at that time, and would actually bring the source books on set and have the cast and director read through them to understand the characters they were playing. While they didn't have a budget really for this movie, they were all doing the best they could with the resources they had, and you can kind of see that in the finished product. The movie feels like D&D. There are actually some good character interactions and some good character moments for everyone. That kind of does feel like, ultimately, it is a group of people playing around a table and having fun. Now, it does still feel like a movie, and a movie with no budget that was made for TV, but it feels more like a D&D movie than the first one did, which is a lot to say this time.
Ever catch a raccoon?
No.
So yes, as I mentioned previously, this series was a trilogy. The third movie was released directly to TV and directly to video, and it was called The Book of Vile Darkness, which was solely based on the source book of the same name, and was released in 2012, directed again by Gary Lively. Now, however, I did not actually watch this one. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I watched almost all of the D&D movies. This one I did not watch, because I didn't want to pay $40 to get a physical copy of it shipped to me from Germany, because it's not available online anywhere. The production house that did it shut down. There are no physical copies in America unless you want to buy them for $40, but for some reason there's a bunch of copies in Europe, and I wasn't going to pay that much to get this movie. However, I did watch this as a kid. I enjoyed it as a kid, but just looking at clips of it, it's not that good. It had even less of a budget than the second movie. Without having watched it, I'm going to say it was probably fine in terms of accuracy to the game. I remember that there was the disease wizard, plague wizard, whatever they were called. That guy was cool. He was called the Vermin Lord, whatever he was called. He was cool. He felt very much like a character from D&D that was made by some edgy player that wanted to make an edgy character. It was pretty fun. But beyond that, didn't watch this movie. I didn't want to pay the money to get a physical copy of it from Germany. So honestly, you're not missing much if you don't see this one either.
Were you killed in the Battle of the Everhorse?
Yes.
One more question, right?
Yes.
So after a trilogy of fairly not good movies, Hasbro, One Media, Wizards of the Coast, whatever you want to call them at this point, decided to finally reboot the D&D film franchise, and in early 2023 released the film Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, written and directed by John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. This movie is so good. I have gushed about it and raved about it to everyone I can possibly think of so many times since seeing the movie, and it truly is an actual D&D movie that feels truly like a D&D movie. The cast is an actual ensemble cast and feel like a party of adventurers that you would find in an actual D&D game at any table you go to, where you have Edgin and Holga, who feel like actual experienced players. You have Simon, who is a fairly mid-range player who's still kind of figuring out a class, or this is his first time playing a sorcerer, but he feels like he's played the game before. Then you have Doric, who feels like an actual brand new player who is like, I have an idea for something, and the DM's just kind of letting them fudge the rules a little bit because they're a brand new player and they're having fun. But then you have the DM NPC of Zank, who is the paladin, who literally just walks in a straight line, helps the party, and then walks out in a straight line as well. But then you also have Forge, who was a previously played character, but then the player had to leave, so then the DM took over and made them an NPC. You have everything in this film, at least for the cast-wise. Now, yes, Edgin and Holga end up being the leads of the movie, but that doesn't mean the ensemble of the film fades at the back. No, they all still have their moments. They all still have their great times, because they all feel like a true adventuring party, which is truly what is supposed to happen in a D&D movie. But even more so, all the characters, they felt like they were true to the characters from the game, with game mechanics from 5th edition, minus some fudging of Doric's druidic beast-shaped powers. But let's be honest, all of us as DMs would want their druids to beast-shape as much as possible, because that's just the coolest thing a druid can do. But beyond all that, interactions as well felt like they truly feel how they do around the table, where you sometimes just have the bard going off on a very long tangent, detailing his 5-page backstory, only to then ask the barbarian, do you want to talk about anything? And them simply replying, nah, I'm good. Because that would happen. Let's be honest, that has happened at every single table and every single game that we have played at Dungeons & Dragons. The movie itself is actually set in the canonical Forgotten Realms of D&D, to the point where they actually have a map at the very beginning of the movie in the title sequence showing the Forgotten Realms, a world built for D&D from the 80s that, again, for some reason they didn't use in the first 3 movies. It's been there the whole time, guys. You could have very easily used it. And beyond that, the creators of this movie are massive nerds and regularly play D&D and have said so. The love is put into the movie in every possible aspect, to the point where if you are an experienced player, you can watch scenes in the movie and say, yeah, the players just failed a roll here, that's why this happened, or yes, the players definitely succeeded this role and succeeded it way past the point that the DM thought about. To summarize it, the D&D movie, Honor Among Thieves, is a perfect D&D movie. Now, is it a perfect movie? No. I don't believe anything truly can be a perfect movie or a perfect anything at all. There are still some issues, but for the movie that you're looking for in this situation, for a Dungeons & Dragons movie that feels like the game that you play regularly with your friends, yes, that's what this movie is. So, funny thing, as I was writing this script, I thought about something else, and it's a kind of a joke that's been on the internet for quite a while at this point. There's actually, if you want to think about it, technically speaking, a 5th movie that feels like a Dungeons & Dragons movie that came out before this latest one, and that's Guardians of the Galaxy.
I have a plan. You've got a plan. Yes.
Now, yes, this has been a long-running joke from Tumblr and Reddit for the longest time I can remember, honestly, ever since this movie came out. If you really think about it, Guardians of the Galaxy is a D&D movie. It's just with Marvel characters and in space, but it's a D&D movie, or at least a great example of one before Honor Among Thieves came out. The characters all feel true to the various archetypes they represent, where you have Star-Lord being a bard or a rogue, Rocket being some type of artificer or wizard, you have Gamora as an assassin, Groot as a druid fighter, and Drax as a straight-up fighter or barbarian. All of them feel like the classes they represent, even though they're in space and also in the comic book franchise. But they all feel like the characters you would see around a table, and they all embody those player types as well, which is really cool. The entire cast is an ensemble, with each of them getting their moments to shine and having their great interactions that a player would have with their other players. And while, yes, Star-Lord is ultimately the lead of the movies, you can't really say that those movies are not ensembles. Every character feels important to the overall story, while there are some times where the characters maybe get a little bit less shine. They all play an important role, which is what a D&D party should feel like. The interactions, as I already said, feel like what you would hear around a table, just all of them being in character the whole time in this really heightened space opera. And the story progression also feels like a D&D adventure, especially in the first movie, where you have simply a character wanting to do some type of small job. Well, then they get thrown in prison because they get caught. However, while then in prison, they meet the rest of the party, they break out, and they're just trying to survive. Well, then they get roped into a much larger conflict with a much larger villain, but the villain isn't necessarily the big bad. No, it's a lieutenant of the big bad, who also is turning on the big bad as well, because that's what villains do. But either way, the story just keeps building and building until it crescendos into a massive climax, where you have the party teaming together with their allies, fighting the big bad of this adventure, and eventually winning. And what's more D&D than that? Nothing, because that's just a D&D story at its heart. And honestly, it's a really good one too. So now that we've gone through all the D&D movies, and one extra one that also feels like a D&D movie, what did we learn? Well, I think ultimately what we can boil this down to is that a Dungeons & Dragons movie doesn't necessarily have to reference the things from Dungeons & Dragons at all, though it does definitely help in the case of Honor Among Thieves. But what it needs to feel like is it needs to feel like a collaborative storytelling experience that you would have with your friends, sitting around a table, rolling some dice, and building a world together. It has to have story progression that actually feels like a logical thing would happen for a game of low-level characters building up an experience to then fight a big boss at the end where they overcome their shortcomings and challenges. It has to have interactions among each other that feel like actual real people joking around a table while they're eating a bunch of snacks and drinking way too much soda and eating way too much pizza. It has to feel like a fun time. I think ultimately that's what it is. It just has to feel like a fun time where there is care and love put behind the movie and put behind the scenes, and the characters have to feel true to the archetypes that they represent, be them fantasy or space opera. The setting doesn't necessarily matter, but it does help. It's just the feeling of it, and that's what the Honor Among Thieves film and Guardians of the Galaxy get right. It gets the feel correct, and I don't know of any two other movies that feel more like Dungeons & Dragons than those two. Hello everyone, And yes, it is actually me here for this end part of the video, for sure. Hope you enjoyed this first take of a video essay of some sort for the channel, and hearing me talk about the Dungeons & Dragons movies. It was definitely an experience watching those original 2 movies, and also now owning them physically on DVD, because physical media is a fun thing. But I hope you all enjoyed it, for sure. And definitely let me know down in the comments, are there any other movies that you know of that feel like Dungeons & Dragons, like how I explained it and described it in the video as well? And also, what do you think about Guardians of the Galaxy being a D&D movie? Let's be honest with ourselves, it is. Either way, hope you all enjoyed this video. Over here is going to be a playlist for other videos from the channel. It'll be reaction videos for the Critical Role series Vox Machina. And over here is going to be a video that YouTube recommends for you as well. Until next time, just stay role-playing, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, peace, everyone. Peace.